Good day. Today is Thursday, 27th February 2025, and Prime Minister Keir Starmer of Britain is apparently now in the United States, and no doubt over the next couple of hours we'll be getting more information about his discussions with President Donald Trump. I will return to that topic in a moment, but first I'm going to start with this incredible, bizarre, increasingly peculiar subject, which is the minerals deal between the United States and Ukraine. And yesterday, the text of the deal, which is supposed or alleged to be ready for signature, which President Zelensky of Ukraine is supposed to be coming to the United States to sign. There were suggestions a couple of days ago, including from President Trump himself, that Zelensky was coming to the United States to sign it on Friday, that is to say tomorrow. Anyway, the text of this most extraordinary agreement has now been published. And I got to say straight away that I'm somebody who has been involved in many negotiations in my life. I've been involved in drawing up all kinds of contracts and commercial agreements, including some very, very complex commercial agreements. I've also been somebody who's had to work through treaties, through EU documents. I remember, for example, wading through, it took me many hours, the 1,000 plus EU association agreement with Ukraine way back in 2013, and many other documents of that kind. And, well, I get to say it straightforwardly that I have never seen anything at any stage of my life that approximates in any way to this document, and I'm going to refer to it as a document that has just been presented as the agreement between the United States and Ukraine about strategic minerals and mineral extractions, and not just minerals extractions, but all sorts of other things. I've never seen anything like this before. This is a document of incredible brevity, given the scope of what it purports to agree, and I'll come to that shortly. It is astonishingly vague about every single particular, even if it were intended merely as kind of heads of agreement, for example. What the Ukrainians are saying that it is, a framework document. It is so vague that I don't fully understand some of its provisions. I'm going to say that straightforwardly now. I'm not even entirely clear as to who exactly the parties to this agreement are supposed to be. Obviously, it's an agreement between Ukraine and the United States, but presumably all sorts of other parties are going to be involved in order to put into effect its terms or apparent terms, and I've no idea who those parties are meant to be. It contains provisions which seem to me to have absolutely no connection with what I had assumed was an economic document. I'm not clear whether this is supposed to be a contract of some kind, and I should say states don't usually enter into contracts with each other, commercial contracts, though I'm not saying that that is impossible or that it has never happened. But it appears to fall short of being a treaty, though some of the wording and language and a few of the words appear to point to it being a treaty. I'm not even entirely sure what exactly it is. I'm going to say one thing, and I'm going to start first with this overriding point, which is that over the last couple of days, since we first got reports in the Financial Times that agreement in principle over this document had been achieved, there were reports that the document somehow is more favorable to Ukraine than the original document that Scott Bassent apparently put before President Zelensky in Kiev, and which Rubio and Vance put before Zelensky in Munich. Supposedly it is more favorable to Ukraine than that earlier document was. Now, I have to say, I don't see that at all. A few points to make. Firstly, a central institution, a key provision, if you like, a key feature of this document is supposed to be the setting up of a fund through which profits from various ventures to be carried out on Ukrainian territory are going to be funneled to the United States and to Ukraine. Now, apparently the original draft said that the United States would have 100% ownership of this fund. Bear in mind, I have never seen the original document, so I can't say definitely that this is so, but in this case, Ukraine and the United States are supposed to be equal owners. Now, that, by the way, already begs questions, because what exactly do we mean here if we're talking about the United States? Do we mean the United States as a whole, the government of the United States? Do we mean certain agencies in the United States, the Department of Commerce, particular departments, other departments of the US government? The Americans might say that that is entirely for them to decide. Perhaps that would be true, but I would say that it'd be unusual if we were looking forward to some later document for that not to be specified. But never mind. Anyway, 50-50 allocation between the United States and Ukraine. But the other provision, which was supposed to be the big sticking point for the Ukrainians, the one that made them incredibly angry, was the provision that apparently required them to pay the United States $500 billion. That was the amount that they were supposed to pay to the United States out of this extraction deal. Presumably, all of the profits in the original draft would have gone to the United States until that figure of $500 billion was reached. Now, of course, that is a ridiculous amount. There is no conceivable way that Ukraine would be able to pay $500 billion from all of these resources. The resources would probably be very quickly exhausted before that figure was ever reached. So one could argue that that was indeed extortionate, and that it would be unrealistic, and it would never be achieved, and that it would be, in effect, deny Ukraine entire use of its resources. Now, this time, Ukraine will, at least for the time being, get half of the profits from these resources. So, yes, I could see that that is a benefit to Ukraine. But as against that, there is now no cap of any kind, none that I can find. I mean, people can look through the document and they can perhaps discover a cap there, or a time limit to this deal, an end point, if you wish. But I don't see one. So yes, the Ukrainians have managed to trade an impossible extortionate cap, which perhaps an alternative approach might have been to try to trade it down, to say, for example, that it would not be $500 billion, but say $100 billion, and that after that sum had been reached, then Ukraine would be able to develop its own resources by itself, something like that, $100 billion, perhaps even a lower amount. Anyway, now what Ukraine has effectively committed itself to, or so it seems to me, is, at least in theory, a provision whereby the United States obtains half the profits of not just Ukraine's minerals, but its logistics, its ports, all sorts of things like that, effectively in perpetuity, or unless the parties decide that this arrangement should end. Now, that in some ways seems to me to be even worse than the original deal. At least the original deal put a theoretical limit to how long this extraction, or how far this extraction would go. As far as I can see, this agreement places no limit at all. In 500 years' time, assuming there's still Ukraine and the United States in existence then, Ukraine would still be providing 50% of the profits of all of these extractions to the United States. Just saying. So, from that perspective, I don't see that this agreement is actually any real improvement. Certainly, it looks to me an incredibly bad deal in that respect. But in some ways, all of this is completely theoretical, because there is so much ambiguity, so much vagueness, so much abstraction about this agreement that I can't really see it as any kind of agreement at all. That is why, perhaps to repeat once more, one shouldn't speak of it as an agreement. One should speak of it instead as a document. I mean, there's no real explanation of how the mechanics of how all of this is going to work, where the fund will be located, for example. Perhaps New York, just saying. No explanation of what mechanisms are going to be used to implement the fund. No pricing formulas or any of that kind of thing that one would expect in a document of this kind. Nor, by the way, is there a list of the assets which would be covered by the fund. Now, that is actually a little surprising because, as I've pointed out in many programs now, the original idea of trading interests in some of these assets, these mineral assets, in return for American aid, originally came from President Zelensky. He was floating this idea in the summer. He discussed it probably in the summer with Lindsey Graham. He brought it up with Donald Trump in September. He mentioned it in his victory plan that he also talked about a couple of months ago. It seems like an age, but in fact it was just a few months ago. So one would have expected that since Zelensky is the person who is coming up with this proposal, because it originated with him, he would, by this point, have obtained a listing of the assets he is actually trading for. But apparently he hasn't. That doesn't seem to have been done. There's just this rather airy assumption that these assets exist and that they can be traded and traded profitably. Just saying. So none of that is there in this document. In addition, however, the document does include provisions which, as I said previously, I would not have expected to find in a document of this kind, which is purports to be some kind of economic agreement. There is a whole paragraph, for example, it's actually in the recitals. It's one of the paragraphs that begins, whereas, where Ukraine is commended for having given up its nuclear weapons in the early 1990s. This, of course, takes us back to the Budapest Memorandum and all of that. Now, I have repeatedly pointed out, it has been an exhausting thing, but I have repeatedly pointed out in program after program that Ukraine never gave up any nuclear weapons. The weapons belonged first to the Soviet Union and then to Russia. They were actually Russian nuclear weapons located on Ukrainian territory. But here we see that this paragraph set out in this agreement, even though, as I said, it seems strangely unconnected to the body of the agreement itself. I assume that Zelensky and his people insisted on inserting it. Zelensky has become obsessional on this topic. He brings up this nuclear issue time after time in a way which, by the way, the Russians have picked up on and which they constantly say proves that Zelensky cannot be trusted and that left to himself, he will press on to obtain nuclear weapons. And I assume that the reason that paragraph is there is because the Ukrainians wanted to insert into the agreement a different paragraph, another paragraph which would have been linked to this earlier one, whereby the United States gave Ukraine some kind of security guarantee. Well, there is no security guarantee in this agreement. There's been media reports in Britain and in the United States that this became a bitter issue of contention between the Ukrainians and the Americans, and that the Trump people made it absolutely clear that this document should not contain a security guarantee. And in fact, there is no security guarantee in this document. But there is a form of words which, again, logically should have no place in a document which is supposed to form part of an economic agreement. And it says that the United States will support Ukraine in its efforts to obtain security guarantees. Now, as the Ukrainian news website Strana has pointed out, in effect, that points to the United States refusing to give Ukraine security guarantees. Logically, it makes no sense for the United States to support Ukraine in obtaining security guarantees from itself. I mean, that is an absurdity. So it appears that this provision requires the United States. I'm not sure in what way it requires the United States, by the way, but at any rate, the United States says it will support Ukraine in obtaining security guarantees from various third parties. And it's not difficult to guess which ones. The Europeans. Well, that's as far as this agreement goes. So we have a very vague, very strange document containing provisions which one would not expect to find in it. Now, here I'm going to make an observation. If this document had committed the United States to providing Ukraine with the kind of security guarantee the Ukrainians are looking for, which is presumably some kind of guarantee that the United States will defend Ukraine in the event of Russian attack, well, that would be some kind of treaty of alliance. And given that it contains military provisions which might require the United States to go to war, that would alter the document profoundly, and I would have thought that in that case it could only gain legal force if it was ratified by the Senate. Anyway, it seems that it's not going to be presented to the Senate. It just falls short of that because it doesn't contain any provisions for security guarantees. I find it very odd that it should be contained in a document of this kind at all. Now, the latest word from Ukraine is that this document, because it is hardly a completed agreement or a treaty or anything like that, is not going to be presented to the Ukrainian parliament, the Rada either. It's so loose, so vague, that there really isn't anything here for the Ukrainian parliament to ratify, which, by the way, I understand is true. And I was hearing last night that Zelensky himself doesn't think that he needs to sign it. It can apparently be signed by officials at ministerial level, but not necessarily by him. I'm not absolutely sure that that is what the Ukrainians are currently saying, but I've heard this from a number of sources, and on the assumption that they're not just repeating each other, I presume this originates from sources within Ukraine itself. Just saying. Well, who knows? I'm not going to explore this further. I agree, by the way, this document as it stands is far too vague to amount to any kind of enforceable agreement or treaty agreement, and I don't see that either the Senate or the Ukrainian parliament would be in a position to ratify it. What would they, in fact, be ratifying? Now, the Ukrainians are saying that this is now all a framework agreement, and it's accepted and understood that, in fact, the real agreements still have to be negotiated, and that there will have to be agreements, presumably, between Ukrainian experts and American experts, and that this will take time, and it may take many months or years, maybe. I mean, usually agreements of this nature do take years, in my experience, to negotiate, as I said, and there's clearly a huge amount to do. As I said, agreements about the structure and placement of the fund, whether the fund, by the way, would be set up with any starting capital, how that would be provided, all kinds of things like that. And of course, as I said, the list of the assets, arrangements about the assets, the pricing formulas, endless numbers of things, which I'm not going to go into a deep discussion of. But anyway, clearly there does still have to be an awful lot that is agreed. But then that brings us back to the question of whether this document represents any sort of real agreement at all. You could argue that it is points of agreement, if you like, that the United States and Ukraine have said that this is something that they propose to do going forward, in which case it's not an agreement, it's not really a commercial agreement, it's not a treaty, obviously. It's simply an intergovernment statement of a kind that governments often make with each other, a statement of intent setting out the long-term plans that governments have agreed with each other. And of course, that isn't uncommon in the world. It happens all the time. But perhaps it's important to say that statements of intent don't always go all the way to reach the point of fruition. I'll give an example Many years ago, about 10 years ago, China and Russia came to an agreement of precisely this kind, that they would build jointly a wide-body jet airliner to rival those being built by Boeing and Airbus. There were various statements of intent to that effect by the Russian and Chinese governments. There were all kinds of agreements also to put this agreement into effect between various Russian and Chinese companies. But in the end, after much debate and discussion, each of these countries decided to go their separate ways. The reason was that the contours, the nature of the wide body could never be agreed on. The Russians wanted one with very long range. The Chinese wanted one with shorter range, but which would be able to carry more passengers. The Chinese wanted to keep production entirely in China. The Russians wanted production to also take place in Russia. The Russians were keen to restart work on their Ilyushin 96 wide body. Well, I'm not going to go into the whole story, but the point is that eventually the parties were not able to fully agree and they went their separate ways. And I wonder whether something similar is going to happen to this document, about which we have been hearing so much now. That when the point actually comes for the Americans and the Ukrainians to sit down and talk to each other about it, whether they will ever be able to put this statement of intent, which is, as I said, all that it is, finally into effect. Now, that, I have to say, brings us back to Zelensky's original objective in floating this proposal in the first place last summer, which is that he was clearly trading this idea of mineral rights and other things in order to get American military support. And when I say American military support, I mean active help from the United States involving the US military. And what he's got is a document that falls far short of that. And the latest word from Ukraine is that he's now saying that he won't sign anything until the agreements are finally reached, whereby the United States will give him the full security guarantees, in other words, the military commitment by the United States to defend Ukraine, that he has been looking for. Otherwise, from his point of view, this thing serves no purpose. It all reminds me, again, very much of the Istanbul Agreement. A draft agreement negotiated over an astonishingly short time by the Ukrainians and the Russians, based mostly, by the way, on Ukrainian drafts, even though they accommodated Russian proposals. The Ukrainians then initial that agreement, but there's no real intention to see it through, and the Ukrainians walk away. And I suspect that at some point the Americans are going to discover that this is all that they have got in this piece of paper that the Ukrainians are providing them with. There seems to be something about the air in Kiev which makes Western officials come away with very, very bizarre documents. A couple of weeks ago, just I think, was it 2 or 3 weeks ago, Keir Starmer went to Kiev and came back with a 100-year treaty with Ukraine, which again contained all kinds of extraordinary provisions, such as that Ukraine would have an irreversible course towards NATO, that the British would be able to open bases on the Black Sea. There are apparently all kinds of secret provisions that we're not even properly informed about. Basically, a list of Ukrainian aspirations. And someone from the United States, and it's not difficult to guess that it's General Kellogg, has met with the Ukrainians and has come back to Washington with this particular proposal, which, frankly, is meaningless and means nothing. It's a purported bribe by the Ukrainians to get military support, and the Americans probably are going to stick by their position and not give Ukraine the military support that it's looking for, in which case this whole document, this whole set of discussions is going to end up in the bin, and in a few months' time will probably be forgotten. Now, I can just about understand why General Kellogg, who's a military man and who probably isn't familiar with commercial negotiations at this level, and certainly not interstate negotiations at this level, might have come away with a document like this. I say General Kellogg because he appears to have been the main interlocutor with Zelensky. He's the person who's been meeting with Zelensky and the other officials in Kiev, and who's been working on the Ukrainians to get them to come up with a document, a draft, which did not include wording about security guarantees. So I'm assuming that it is he who ultimately worked on this draft with the Ukrainians. Anyway, I can understand why Kellogg, who, as far as I'm aware, is a military officer, I'm sure he's done commercial and business work himself, but I accept this is probably not his area of specialty. I can just about understand why Kellogg, who also impresses me as being rather sympathetic to the Ukrainians, more so than other people in the US administration, would come back to Washington with a document of this kind. But the perhaps more important question is why the far more tough-minded, business-savvy people in Washington, people like Elon Musk, for example, and J.D. Vance, just saying, and of course Donald Trump himself, are impressed with or take seriously a document like this. They must understand, because all of them have experience in negotiating these kind of agreements, that what they've actually got is a document which commits no one to anything. Just saying. So why have they spent so much time and energy to extract it from the Ukrainians? Well, there are various theories. One theory is that it is a way that these people do indeed still want the United States to be deeply involved in Ukraine, that this is their mechanism of drawing the United States into the war, justifying or rationalizing continued US military support for Ukraine, that ultimately the United States will get money for all the weapons it is giving. Well, there may be some truth to this. Donald Trump himself has spoken words which appear to support that thesis. He said that if the United States continues to give money to Ukraine or weapons to Ukraine, well, at least now it has the prospect of getting the money back. By the way, that isn't true. I mean, even if all the contracts are finalized and agreed and brought up to a satisfactory level, there is still the little question of building the mines, setting up, as I said, all the structures on Ukraine, that the processing plants, all of those things, and operating the ports, and doing all of those things properly to bring them into line with the provisions of, well, let's call it this agreement. That in itself would take years. Even if all went well, it would still take a long time before the United States saw any profit from this undertaking. And given the doubts that are now growing about whether Ukraine really does have large quantities of strategic minerals and such things, it's arguable that the United States will never get a profit from this undertaking. In terms of rare earths, for example, I've heard that surveys have shown that a lot of the rare earths can be found in the United States itself, on the territory of the United States, and it would probably be cheaper and make more commercial and other sense to extract them there. Just saying. But, I can't believe, going back to what I was saying about the people who understand and know about these things in Washington, which includes, of course, Trump himself, that they're really blind to the absurdities of this document. And I can't really believe that they expect that they can sell the American people with the idea that a long-term commitment to Ukraine is going to profit the United States, because I think they must know that it will take only a relatively short time before the absurdity of that became obvious. So I rather doubt this. There's a second theory, which is that this is intended to obtain leverage over the Russians in negotiations. It's intended to present the Russians with the fact that the United States now has all of these big interests in Ukraine, and that supposedly will deter the Russians from either pressing forward with their advances into Ukraine, because doing so would mean that they would come up against American interests, and that by itself supposedly would be enough to deter the Russians. Or alternatively, that as the big owner of all of these assets in Ukraine, the United States could perhaps trade them with the Russians. They could perhaps use these assets to bribe the Russians with co-production deals and that sort of thing. I'm going to say it straightforwardly. If the Americans think that they can pull that one off with the Russians, if they come and present the Russians with this document and tell the incredibly tough-minded Russian negotiators, who now include Kirill Dmitriev, who is the head of Russia's direct investment fund, and by the way, a former Wall Street banker, if they think that the Russians would be impressed by this document, then I'm going to say it, they would probably laugh. Not in the room where this document was presented, but with each other. The Russians probably, and I say this because, of course, it's important to remember that Ukraine was formerly a part of the Soviet Union, and that there are Soviet surveys of these strategic minerals in Ukraine, though they're apparently very vague. But the Russians probably have a better knowledge of what really is in Ukraine than the Americans do. They're probably aware that some of the expectations are anyway wildly overstated. But putting all that aside, they would look at this document and they would quickly work out that it is actually meaningless, that it means absolutely nothing. So the Russians would not see this as giving the Americans leverage over them. They would know that the Americans have no real investments in Ukraine to defend. And they would also know that the Americans have no real investments in Ukraine to trade. So I don't see this as providing any leverage at all. So I come back to this question. Why are the Americans showing interest in this document? Why are they going along with the fiction that it means something when it means nothing? Well, the only explanation I can think of is that Donald Trump is someone who, as he has demonstrated many times, and as he has, by the way, himself written, always seeks to place himself in a dominant position over anyone that he has to deal with. And the Americans have come to understand in the last couple of weeks, as I've discussed in recent programs, and by the way, as Vladimir Putin discussed in his recent interview with Pavel Zarubin, the Americans have come to understand that Zelensky is the major problem in negotiating peace in Ukraine, which is something that the Americans at the moment want. By the way, they've been given further evidence of this today. Zelensky has made further statements today that he's not prepared even to agree a ceasefire unless he is given cast iron security guarantees, things that the United States has ruled out giving. So the fact that Zelensky is the roadblock, the obstacle to peace, has just been provided, just been given a further expression. Anyway, the Americans see all of this. Donald Trump has seen all of this, and he needs to demonstrate to Zelensky that he's not going to be pushed around, that he's going to extract even these sort of documents from Zelensky as a way of impressing upon Zelensky that it is the United States, not Ukraine, that it is Donald Trump, not Zelensky, that ultimately has the power in the relationship. One of the big complaints that the Trump people have been making, and by the way, in this they are perfectly correct, is that in the relationship between Biden and Zelensky, that relationship was unequal in the wrong way. It was Zelensky who was the dominant partner over Joe Biden. Zelensky would come along and would demand things from Biden, and Biden would sometimes complain and grumble and get annoyed, but he would in the end always give Zelensky whatever he wanted. Whereas this time, the Americans want to make it clear to Zelensky that the rules of the game have changed. From now on, it is the United States and Donald Trump who are in the dominant position, not Zelensky and Ukraine. So I could see how getting Zelensky to present a draft document, to agree to a draft document, which hands over in perpetuity the proceeds of half of Ukraine's, I should say, undeveloped assets to the United States in return for effectively nothing at all, that is an effective way for the Americans to make it clear to Zelensky that far from he being the dominant partner in the relationship is emphatically the United States. And that, I suspect, is what this is ultimately all about. Now, I spent a huge amount of time on this. I don't propose to spend any more. This has been argued and discussed and talked about, well, to the point of distraction over the last week. I am very skeptical that this document will be taken any further, just as the Russians expected that there would be more negotiations to finalize the remaining points in the Istanbul draft agreement. So I expect some people in the United States to expect the same. With this document, the Ukrainians never negotiated with the Russians to finalize the outstanding points in the Istanbul agreement, which has taken, of course, a lot further than this document is. And I suspect the same will happen to this document as well. Over the next couple of weeks and months, we will gradually hear less and less about it, and it will fade away. But the Americans perhaps have made their point and have shown to Zelensky that yes, this is an unequal partnership, but it's unequal in America's favor and not Ukraine's. Now, in saying all of this, it's important to say again, though, that this might not be quite as straightforward as the Americans themselves perhaps assume. There's been an astonishing article in The Spectator by, well, a former Ukrainian official, that's all we're told, who writes under the pen name Oleksiy Kosach, which provides an astonishing insight into Zelensky's personality and of his way of ruling Ukraine. And the title of the article is "Only Trump, Not Zelensky, Could Save Ukraine." And at least some of what Donald Trump has said about Zelensky is true. Now, The Spectator in Britain is a centre-right magazine. It used to be effectively the house organ of the Conservative Party, even though, of course, it's independent of the Conservative Party. At one time, its editor was none other than Boris Johnson. And by the way, and for the record, and I say this despite my deep dislike of the man, by all accounts, he was a good editor. It's a shame that he didn't stick to journalism, just saying. But anyway, this article about Zelensky, about his personality, will come as a shock to many people in Britain because it describes a deeply manipulative, somewhat paranoid individual, a person who is obsessed with approval, adulation, who continues the war, partly in order to maintain control, but also for reasons of personal gain, both for himself and for his close associates. Somebody who has become increasingly authoritarian and repressive in the way that he rules Ukraine, and somebody who is steadily demoralizing Ukraine and who has lost the support of the Ukrainian people. The article contains paragraphs like this. Ukraine has become a paradox, a nation fighting for its sovereignty whilst dismantling its own democratic foundations. The West has indulged in the illusion of Zelensky as the face of democracy. In reality, he has undermined our democracy, institutions and economy, making Ukraine much weaker in the face of an existential threat and in the process destroying our nation's motivation to fight the Russian aggressor. And then this article basically casts doubt on the opinion polls about Zelensky's popularity in Ukraine. The person who's written this article, whose identity I should stress, I don't know, says that he or she has seen private opinion polls which put Zelensky's actual rating at below 10%. Not that different from the 4% that Donald Trump was talking about a short time ago. Maybe Donald Trump has seen some of these same opinion polls as this person has done. Just saying. And anyway, the article talks about the way in which Ukraine has been demoralized, that Ukraine, exhausted of every resource, cannot withstand a prolonged war of attrition. Thousands of men have paid bribes to flee the only European country with sealed borders. Those who remain live in fear, wary of stepping outside lest they be seized off the streets, in cafes or in shops. It talks about how some of the latest draftees are disabled or chronically ill, how many receive little or no training before deployment. He talks about Zelensky with unchecked power, enabling his security forces to act with impunity in at least 8 frontline regions. Martial law has given rise to police and military excesses. Under the pretext of hunting down collaborators, state forces raid homes, search phones and laptops, and detain civilians arbitrarily. And the author makes a point, which I, by the way, made many times, that in this atmosphere, opinion polls and opinion surveys cannot be trusted. And then the article says some really rather extraordinary things, that with no clear purpose left in the fight, many now seek an alternative, a pro-Russian candidate willing to strike a deal with Putin, or even the grim resignation that life under a Russian flag might be preferable to endless war. The shallow patriotism that Zelensky promotes is crumbling. Exhaustion has set in. The question is no longer whether Ukraine can win, but whether it can even survive his rule. And the author of the article starts by making the point, I have known Vladimir Zelensky for very well for years. As a senior official personally appointed by Zelensky, I spoke to him many times a day and observed him closely, both in public and privately. We parted on good terms and without rancor. I have no personal axe to grind. So, I think, well, I should say first of all that this article rings true. It fully accords with my own understanding of Zelensky's personality, of the way in which he rules in Ukraine, of the reality of what Ukraine today has become. And I'm going to suggest, going back to this extraordinary minerals agreement, that the Trump people need to understand that you can play games of dominance with conventional players, with people who act according to what might be called normal rules of conduct. But Zelensky is, shall we say, not a person like that. And that even if you think that you've achieved ascendancy over him, you might find that you have not, that he remains as manipulative and as, shall we say, duplicitous as ever. I suspect that sooner or later the Americans will understand that. The Americans have already been talking about the moment when Zelensky should go. This is why some people, those officials in the US government who I think have already basically seen through the realities of Zelensky, have been talking increasingly about elections. And, well, of course, the Russians have come to the same conclusion. And America, if it really does want peace, is not in the same position as Russia. Putin, in that interview he gave to Zarubin, which I discussed in a recent program, spoke about how having such an extraordinary personality as Zelensky, one who makes irrational decisions, who governs Ukraine in such an extraordinary way, who gives such bizarre orders to the Ukrainian military, how that plays to Russia's advantage. But of course, for the Russians, Zelensky is their enemy. For the Americans, he is their proxy and ally. So what might be seen as beneficial to the Russians is not beneficial to the Americans in any way. Anyway, just say. Now, let's move on and deal now with the topic of Keir Starmer's visit to the United States. Now, Keir Starmer, it seems to me, is trying to do exactly the same thing that Emmanuel Macron tried to do when he came to the United States on Monday. Now, Macron, whatever you may think of him, and I don't think very much, just to say, but Macron is at least skillful with words. He has a kind of facile charm, the kind that always puts me on my guard, by the way, but some people fall for it. Anyway, Macron has those particular qualities. He's able to laugh at jokes that he probably secretly doesn't like. He can appear jovial and humorous in your company, all of those things. Well, no one would say that of Keir Starmer, who comes across by contrast as dull, plodding, and, well, I think perhaps it's fair to say somewhat arrogant. So I don't know how Starmer expects to succeed where Macron conspicuously failed. The two are clearly working together. And the idea is, the transparent ploy is to get an American commitment to back a European peacekeeping or reassurance force to Ukraine. Now, to be very clear, this force is being presented as a peacekeeping force. The Europeans are saying that it will only be sent to Ukraine following an agreement with the Russians as a result of peace negotiations. The Russians have gone out of their way to make clear again and again and again that they are ruling this whole idea out. They've said that this is unacceptable to them. They will never agree to troops from NATO countries entering Ukrainian territory. That the only venue, the only agency able to authorize deployment of peacekeepers is the UN Security Council. So they will never agree to this proposal. The Americans, for their part, and Donald Trump repeated this in his first cabinet meeting. He again said flatly, Ukraine will never join NATO. He went further in saying this, by the way, than he has ever said before. He also said that he basically said that the United States is not giving any US security guarantees to Ukraine. Anyway, the Europeans are not unaware of all of this, but it's not difficult, as I say, to work out their plan. Even if the Russians never agree, even if there is no UN, no decision about this in the UN, what they will probably hold out for is a scenario where after a ceasefire, and the Russians, by the way, have just again ruled out the idea of a ceasefire. Lavrov did so emphatically in his words in Qatar, which I discussed in my program yesterday. But the idea is that after a ceasefire, the Europeans and Zelensky will unilaterally agree to this with each other. The British and the French will send their troops to Ukraine. And if the Americans say that they support this move, the French and the British will come round to the Americans and will say that they've been given the American guarantee, the American backstop. And then the Americans will be put in a very awkward position. Do they repudiate what their British and French allies are saying? In which case that would create a huge crisis within NATO, which is already in serious difficulties. Or do they go along? And then, of course, it comes back to the Russians. The Russians would be furious if this was ever done. But do they then attack the British and the French, risking a war with the Americans? Do they say it's a violation of the agreement? In which case, as I said, they attack the British and the French forces? Or do they hold back and accept it, in which case NATO troops are established in Ukraine? And, well, Starmer and Zelensky have agreed that Ukraine, in that case, is on an irreversible course towards NATO. Now, the Russians are watching all of this. They are looking at all of this. Lavrov said yesterday that this is a device, this whole topic is intended to prolong the war. The point is that if the Russians come to the view that any agreement with Ukraine to end the war or to stop the war leads to the deployment of British and French troops in Ukraine, then they will continue the war in order to prevent it. Just as the West, holding out the prospect of NATO membership in the past, incentivized the Russians to continue the war, so the prospect of British and French and other European peacekeepers being deployed to Ukraine also incentivizes the Russians to continue the war. Now, I hope the United States understands this, because I don't think for the moment that they do. If the Americans really do want to bring the conflict in Ukraine to an end, then the best thing that they can do, in my opinion, is that they can say to the British and the French that ultimately they can't prevent the British and the French coming to whatever agreements or arrangements with Zelensky that they want, but that the United States, from this point now, wants to make it crystal clear that if those British and French troops do go to Ukraine without the agreement, the express agreement of the United States and Russia, then those troops are indeed on their own. In which case, I am confident that the British and the French will not deploy those troops. The idea is already very unpopular in France, and interestingly and importantly, it is now starting to get pushback in Britain. Articles are starting to appear, I've read some of them, from various British correspondents and journalists, including even that extreme hardliner, Con Coughlin, talking about what a very bad idea this is. If the Americans make it absolutely clear right from the beginning that if the British and the French go to Ukraine in the way that I've said, then they're on their own, then those troops will not go, and we could find our way eventually towards some kind of a settlement. Now, there is something about this which does very greatly concern me, which is that Donald Trump has now said twice that in his conversations with Vladimir Putin, Putin said that he had no objection to these European deployments. I don't believe that Putin ever said anything of the sort. It is completely out of line to what Russian officials are saying, including what Lavrov has been saying over the last 2 days, which is, of course, after Putin and Trump spoke. Either Trump misunderstood what Putin was saying, or, and there's no nice way to say this, he's lying and is inventing something that Putin never said. Perhaps this also is part of the games that the Americans like to play. The Americans at the moment, or at least Trump at the moment, may be looking ultimately to shift the burden of the conflict onto the Europeans. In fact, Trump, during that cabinet meeting, said that very thing, that the United States is going to stop providing, is basically looking to end its material support for Ukraine. It's going to be passed on to the Europeans from this point on. And it may be that Trump is trying to say to the Europeans, look, it's your business. You want to take over. It's your affair. We're not interested. And, you can work it out with the Russians. And we don't think that with the Russians you're going to have any problems. Maybe that's the objective here. But I still think it's dangerous to place words in Vladimir Putin's mouth, words which he never said and which contradict those which he has, in fact, actually said. I think that all it does is feed distrust between the Russians and the Americans, and if anything, it obstructs the course towards peace. Now, Putin has been speaking about this today. Now, he spoke to the board of the FSB. The FSB is Russia's primary counterintelligence agency. And he spoke about the fact that the world is changing, that there is some reason now to think that the international situation, or at least the relations between the United States and Russia, are improving. He also said something else, which I do want to repeat, actually, because he made exactly the same point that I have made, that the reason we are seeing these changes is because the Russian army is winning the war in Ukraine. I said that in my program, I think yesterday, at some length, that if the Russians were not winning the war in Ukraine, we would not be looking at diplomacy now. We would be looking at something completely different. The entire shape of international relations would be completely different if the Russians had lost from what they are now, when the Russians are going to win. I'll just say what Putin said. Today's dynamic changes in the international landscape are to a large extent the result of the courage and fortitude of our armed forces. It was they who, with their valor, their daily victories, created the conditions for the beginning of a serious dialogue, a dialogue about a fundamental solution to both the Ukrainian and other crises. So there we go. He said it. He says exactly the same point that I made, as I said, in my program yesterday. But then he talks about how there is now at least a chance that relations between the United States and Russia might start to improve. But then he goes on to say this: we understand that not everyone is happy with the resumption of Russian-American contacts. Some Western elites, it's not difficult to guess who he means, are still determined to maintain instability in the world, and these forces will try to disrupt or compromise the dialogue that has begun. We see this. We need to take this into account, and use all possibilities of diplomacy and special services to disrupt such attempts. And most importantly, as before, it is important for us to firmly defend our national interests, sovereignty, life and freedoms of our citizens from any threats. So it's not difficult to guess who he means. And of course, he's clearly pointing here to the Europeans, and he's pointing clearly, first and foremost, to the British and to the French. And undoubtedly, he has this discussion about deploying peacekeepers in Ukraine in mind. He understands, exactly as Lavrov understands, and as Lavrov said in his comments in Qatar the day before yesterday, that this whole project of sending European troops to Ukraine is a wrecking maneuver. It's intended to prevent a settlement of the war. It is intended to prolong the war. And of course, if the Europeans can get a guarantee of some sort from the United States, it is intended also to draw the United States into the war as well. So, well, I hope, as I said, that this is understood in Washington, and this will require some careful handling of Starmer. I think it's fair to say, I have no doubt, I've already said it, that Trump completely outmaneuvered, outsmarted Macron when Macron came to Washington on Monday. Starmer is a rather different personality. He's more pedantic and more careful. He is a trained lawyer, after all. It might be wise, in his case, to engage in some straight talking. Just saying. Anyway, there we go. Now, obviously, even as the discussions go on, and by the way, as I'm making this program, the Russians and the Americans are meeting in the American consulate in Istanbul. There was, I saw earlier today a video of a huge Mercedes minivan driving up to the American consulate with the Russian negotiating team. We've no idea who they are, but they appear to be middle rank officials rather than the top ranking people. Both the Russians and the Americans, interestingly, have said that progress in these discussions will make clear to each side how much sincerity there generally is in this project to improve relations. So even though they're talking strictly on the question of diplomatic representation in each of their capitals, this is, if you like, these talks are a bellwether, an indication of how well and fast this process of normalization is really going to go. Just saying. But anyway, there's been no word so far of what, if anything, has been agreed. The talks have been going on for 6.5 hours, which, by the way, is a good sign, I would say. It suggests that they really are getting out. They really are working through the details, because this is a complex question. They really are working through the details, and they're working through, and they might be moving forward towards some kind of maybe not a full resumption of the embassies, but at least a re-establishment of the embassies and steps being taken to resume contacts properly. But anyway, we shall just have to wait and see, and no doubt we will know more about this by later this evening or perhaps by tomorrow. In the meantime, just as the Americans and the Russians, well, at least the Russians supported the Americans at the UN Security Council the day before yesterday, in getting the Security Council to pass the first resolution about Ukraine against European opposition. The Americans and the Russians did the same thing in the unusual venue of the World Trade Organization, where somewhat unusually the World Trade Organization now has been routinely issuing statements criticizing Russia for its war of aggression against Ukraine. Apparently this time the United States abstained, refused to participate in the release of that statement, to the further dismay of its European allies. So, here we are. We will see where all this goes. But this has been, in some respects, an important week. We've had the pushback, if you like, from the steps the previous week, the previous 2 weeks, that the Trump administration took to unblock the dialogue with Russia. Hegseth's speech at the Munich Security Conference, Trump's call to Putin, J.D. Vance's Hegseth's speech was to the Ramstein meeting, J.D. Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference, the vote a couple of days ago at the United Nations. Now we've had the pushback, the attempted pushback, the minerals deal, which the Ukrainians have been coming up with, the Macron visit. The big test, I think, now is going to be the Starmer visit. We will see what, if anything, Starmer comes back with. If Starmer comes back with nothing, which I rather expect, by the way, or at least nothing concrete, and if the Americans and the Russians can come to some kind of understanding about the embassies with each other in Istanbul, then we can say, I think, definitively that this process is indeed on track. And, well, in the meantime, of course, the war goes on. Now, I'm going to do a very, very brief summary about the military situation in Ukraine, which, of course, Putin talked about. There are reports today that the village of Lebedeva in Kursk region has now also been captured by the Russians, and the Russians have captured more villages as they press southwards from Pogrebki towards Malaya Lochnia. By my estimate, if all of these captures by the Russians are true, then the Ukrainian salient in Kursk has shrunk to about 20% of its maximum size. It's basically Suja and a small belt of territory around it. I suspect that we are indeed looking at critical days for the Ukrainian force in Suja. And I'm going to also guess that there's going to be a massive row in Kiev about what to do about it, with Syrskyi probably trying to get Zelensky to agree to a withdrawal, and Zelensky probably throwing tantrums and refusing to permit it. So we are probably not very far from that point. Now, there's been lots of news from other parts of the front lines, particularly rapid Russian advance, for example, around Velikaya Novosilka. But I'm going to make a general observation, which is that I've noticed that the Ukrainians are now coming up with ever more interesting claims. There was the claim that they'd carried out a successful counterattack in Donetsk, the claim that they'd captured the village of Kotlino. Now they're claiming that they still control parts of Andreevka, southwest of Kurachovo, despite apparently photographic evidence that the Russians are indeed in control, that there are still Ukrainian troops holding out elsewhere inside the previous area which the Ukrainians controlled south of Kurakovo, in Urakli, and even east of Urakli. And some of this information is being supported by Deep State, the Ukrainian mapping project. Now, I remember that a couple of weeks ago, Deep State found itself under severe pressure. It was even closed down for a short time. And I wonder whether some of this information that we're now getting from the Ukrainians is true. Bear in mind, I am not there on the front lines. I don't know what is actually going on. But all of this information that we've heard about Toretsk, about Kotlino, but especially, I mean, I can accept the possibility of Ukrainian raids into Kotlino and of potentially the Ukrainian recapture of Kotlino, and the Ukrainian advance, a Ukrainian raid to capture some buildings in Toretsk. I think the Ukrainian army is capable of doing these things, and the front lines in those areas are still a bit ragged, though I should say that in the Pokrovsk area where Kotlino is located, the actual news this morning appears to point to further Russian advances rather than successful Ukrainian counterattacks. But I can accept that news might be true. But I am much more skeptical about suggestions that the Kurakovo cauldron is still not cleared in the way that the Russians say. It appears to contradict too much of the accumulated evidence on the ground. And I wonder whether the word has gone out, including to Deep State, that in this particularly difficult time for Ukraine, optimistic news must be published and given priority. In which case, perhaps we ought to be very careful before accepting these Ukrainian claims. Well, that's all I'm going to say. Now, I want to finish with one last topic, and it is an important one, and it is in fact so important and so concerning that I had been considering publishing it at the start of this video, but I've noticed that when I do things like that, well, all sorts of things happen. The shall we say, the service provider seems to get a bit worried, and anyway, it gets less circulation than it might. So I've parked it at the end. But the situation in Romania is becoming extremely concerning. Now, Mr. Gheorghescu, the candidate who conclusively won or came first in the first round of the Romanian election, which was held in December, has just attempted to re-register for the new elections, which are supposed to be taking place in May. Opinion polls in Romania show that he is the clear favourite. He has the support apparently of around 40% of people. So it's not a majority, but it is a strong plurality, and very likely he would win the first round again, and quite possibly, if he was able to campaign, he would go on to win the second round and would become the president of Romania. Well, on his way to register, he was arrested by the police. He was taken out of his car. He was, I won't say he was roughed up, but he was certainly handled, shall we say, with less than gentleness, despite the fact that he's known to be suffering from an injury. And he was held for 6.5 hours, and he came out banned from appearing on social media, making public speeches, engaging in any of the normal activity that a candidate in an election would be expected to engage in. And he was charged with a whole lot of offences, of supposed crimes, some of which don't seem to me to be crimes, or at least they're not crimes that I've ever heard of before. And, well, which never seemed to concern anybody in Romania before he won the first round of the election in December, despite the fact that he had fairly well-known views. He has apparently actually represented Romania in certain venues. So, to me, I have to say this looks like a transparent attempt to prevent Georgescu standing and winning the forthcoming Romanian election. And it is an astonishing act by the Romanian political class. I can't imagine that the judicial figure, the prosecutor, who was formally behind these moves, didn't understand the nature of what he was doing, just saying. But as I said, it seems to me an astonishing and deeply concerning action. And, well, it calls into question, I'm picking my words now very carefully, it calls into question the reality of the integrity of the Romanian election process. Now, a number of years ago, I used to remember reading all kinds of articles about how Russia had supposedly this so-called managed democracy. There were lots of articles about this. It was a description of Russian democracy that was attributed to Russian officials, though I never actually found the any citation from any Russian official that actually used that expression. I did come across many citations that referred to Russia being a sovereign democracy, but that is, of course, a rather different concept. But the point was a managed democracy in which some parties could stand, but others couldn't, and some candidates would be allowed to participate in elections, but others couldn't. And what a terrible and bad thing that was. And I remember people saying that a managed democracy is one which is not a democracy at all. Well, I have to say to something, I basically agree with that. But here we are, and we see in Romania that Romania is becoming exactly that. An individual who has views, and I should make it clear, I far from agree with Georgescu about all of the things he says. I think some of his assessments of former Romanian leaders, particularly the former Romanian dictator Ion Antonescu, I completely disagree with. But anyway, here we have somebody who was able to stand in the first round of an election a few months ago, who unexpectedly won, who then had his victory cancelled on claims of Russian interference, which have never been proved and which are almost certainly wrong. And there are steps being made to prevent him standing again. And he now, given that he's been prosecuted for various crimes, he now seems to be at serious risk of being sent to prison for no other reason than because he is a candidate in an election in Romania, which it looks likely, if he were to stand, that he would win. How is that reconcilable to Romania being a democracy? I can't see that it is. It is a disastrous path. I worry that, well, I can easily believe that it will destabilize Romania itself. And of course, on the part of the Romanian authorities, it is also an incredible act of defiance against the United States, whose Vice President, J.D. Vance, has already criticized Romania's handling of the previous Romanian election, the previous decision to cancel Gheorghescu's win of the first round of the Romanian election. Well, it's not just an act of defiance, it's an extraordinary act, in my opinion, towards repression. Now, it's not, unfortunately, confined to Romania. The other day, I read in an article in the Financial Times by the journalist Martin Wolf, an article very critical of the United States and of the Trump administration, and it contained these words. One might respond, and this is about J.D. Vance's complaints, one might respond that Europeans know better than Americans what happens when the enemies of freedom come to power through elections. That sentence is there. It's clearly, by the way, a reference to what happened in Germany in the 1930s. Can that remotely relate to what's going on in Romania today? Is that a sentence one should even place in an article like this? How can one even speak of freedom when people are being imprisoned simply because they stand for election in their own country and look like they're going to win? Anyway, that's all I want to say. We've done a video about this, by the way, on the Duran, which when it comes out you can watch. But that's all I'm going to say about it on this program. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, please remember, if you like this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.